Tonight, we revisit one case that fixed itself in the criminal record of Victorian London and never afterward loosened its hold. It is a matter of a mother and her infant daughter, of a rented parlour in Kentish Town, and of a conviction returned at the Central Criminal Court in the last December of 1890. One household, one October afternoon, one sentence carried out within prison walls that entered the national record and has remained there. The case of Mary Eleanor Wheeler begins in the northern districts of London in the autumn of 1890. To understand what happened and where, one must first understand the geography, because the geography is not decoration. It is the mechanism by which the crime was committed, and in the end, the mechanism by which it was discovered. The events belong to a band of North London parishes that had, within living memory, been fields and market gardens, and which the expansion of the capital across the middle decades of the century had filled with terraced streets, villas, and the railway lines that made such streets possible. Kentish Town, Camden Town, Chalk Farm, Belsize, Hampstead, St. John's Wood, and the newer roads climbing toward Finchley formed a continuous fabric of brick, broken only by the heights of Hampstead, and the open ground that still survived here and there between the building estates. This was not the London of the docks or the East End rookeries. It was, for the most part, a district of the respectable and the aspiring, clerks, tradesmen, small proprietors, furniture porters and carpenters and removers, families who kept a servant if they could afford one, and who measured their standing by the quality of the street they lived in, and the address they could put at the head of a letter. Priory Street, Kentish Town, where much of this account is set, was a street of small terraced houses of the ordinary sort, the kind let room by room or floor by floor, close enough to the Kentish Town Road and its shops and public houses to be convenient, and served by the Metropolitan Railway, whose stations at Kentish Town, Chalk Farm, and the Finchley Road stitched the whole district to the centre of the city and to the suburbs beyond. A woman on foot could cross a great deal of this ground in an afternoon. A woman with a perambulator could cross it too more slowly, and be seen doing so by any number of people going about their own business. And it is that ordinary, unremarkable sight. A woman pushing a child's carriage through the evening streets, that the record establishes as the hinge of the entire matter. The Prince of Wales Road, a longer and busier thoroughfare, ran nearby, and it is there, at number 141, that the family at the centre of this account kept their rooms. The distances involved are short. From the Prince of Wales Road to Priory Street was a walk of minutes. From Priory Street, north and west, lay Hampstead and Crossfield Road within it, and beyond that St. John's Wood with Hamilton Terrace, and beyond that again the roads running up toward Finchley. All of these names will return. It is worth holding them in the mind as one holds the streets of one's own neighbourhood, because the crime that follows was not committed in some remote or hidden place. It was committed indoors, in a rented parlour on an ordinary street, on a Friday afternoon in late October, while the lamps were being lit and families were sitting down to tea. And it was concealed, so far as it was concealed at all, by nothing more elaborate than the anonymity of a crowded city and a drawn blind. The season matters as much as the place. Late October in London means early darkness, the afternoon failing by 5, the evening streets lit by gas and busy with people returning from work. It means cold and closed windows, and neighbours less inclined to be in their yards or leaning over their fences. What could be done on such an evening and carried through such streets and left in such places depended on all of these conditions, and the record shows that they held. Keep, then, the picture of the perambulator and the short streets between the Prince of Wales Road and the open ground to the north, and the failing light. The rest of this account is, in a sense, the working out of what those streets and that hour allowed. The murdered woman was Phoebe Hogg, formerly Phoebe Styles, and she is one of the two people at the centre of this case about whom the surviving record is, in a particular and telling way, least generous. She was, at the time of her death, a woman of about 31 or 32 years of age. She had married Frank Samuel Hogg, a furniture remover, in November of 1888, and the record establishes, from the sworn testimony of her husband at the subsequent trial, that she was some 3 months into a pregnancy at the time of that marriage, and that a daughter was born to the couple on the 11th of April 1889 and christened Phoebe Hanslope Hogg, a child known within the family by an affectionate diminutive. Mother and daughter therefore shared the same given name, a small circumstance that runs through every account of the case, and that lends its own quiet weight to what followed. Of Phoebe Hogg's own origins, the record offers less than one would wish. She had relatives named Styles, a niece, Elizabeth, and others who spoke to the press after her death, and her father, whom she was thought at one point to have gone to visit, was an ill man living out toward Rickmansworth and Chorley Wood, in the country beyond the north-western edge of London. But the details of her early life, her parents' names and station, the place and circumstances of her birth, are not established with any certainty in the popular record that has come down, and it would be a false economy, in an account that claims to rest on evidence, to supply them from imagination. The plain truth is that Phoebe Hogg enters history very largely at the moment she leaves it, that she's known to us, overwhelmingly, through the testimony of others given after her death, through her husband, through her sister-in-law, through neighbours, through the surgeons who examined her, and through the reporters who filled the newspapers with her name. Whatever physical descriptions survive of her come from those sources and must be understood as representations rather than as any independent likeness. She was said to have stood about 5 feet 6 inches in height. Beyond such fragments, the record is thin. What the record does establish, and establishes clearly, is her situation in the months before her death, because that situation is the ground on which everything else grew. The Hoggs kept rooms at 141 Prince of Wales Road, where Phoebe and Frank occupied one floor, and Frank's mother and his sister Clara lived above. It was, on its surface, an ordinary arrangement of a young married household sharing a house with the husband's family. Beneath that surface ran a complication that Phoebe herself may only partly have understood. Her husband had, both before their marriage and during it, maintained an intimate connection with another woman, a woman whom Phoebe not only knew but had come to regard for a time as a friend, and who had, earlier that same year, in the February of 1890, helped to nurse Phoebe through a bout of illness. That woman was Mary Eleanor Wheeler, known to the Hoggs and to the neighbourhood as Mrs. Piercy. It is here that the two lives converge, and it is here that this section of the account must close, without anticipating what is to come. In the ordinary way of things, the relations between the two women had been at least outwardly cordial. Mary had attended Phoebe in her sickness. Mary was a visitor the family trusted, and it was to Mary's door, on the afternoon of the 24th of October, 1890, in answer to a written invitation to tea, that Phoebe Hogg went on foot, pushing her daughter before her in the child's perambulator through the short streets that separated the two houses. What the invitation set in motion is the subject of the sections that follow. For the moment, it is enough to establish the connection and to let it stand. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. The woman known to the case as Mrs. Piercy was, by her true name, Mary Eleanor Wheeler, and she was born, so far as the record establishes, on the 26th of March, 1866. Of her childhood, almost nothing certain survives, and here the honest course is to say so plainly rather than to fill the silence. She was one of the two figures in this account of whom the record is least forthcoming, and much of what was printed about her early years belongs not to the register of established fact, but to the register of Victorian journalism at its least disciplined. One claim in particular illustrates the danger. It was reported and repeated, and for many years believed, that Mary Wheeler's father had himself been a murderer, a man tried and hanged for the killing of a farmer some 10 years before his daughter's own crime. The claim was false. It rested on a confusion of names. The man hanged for that earlier murder was a different Wheeler entirely, and the newspaper that first printed the story is understood to have afterward issued a retraction. Modern research into the family has found that Mary's father, James Wheeler, died not on a scaffold, but of injuries sustained in an accident, having been carried home unable to move and lingering only a matter of days. The episode is worth pausing on, because it shows how readily, in a case of this kind, legend attaches itself to fact and hardens into something that requires verification against the primary materials before it can be trusted at all. The record establishes the crime for which Mary Wheeler was actually convicted. It does not support the lurid genealogy that grew up around her. The name by which she is remembered was not, in the strict sense, her own. In her late teens, she had formed a connection with a carpenter named John Charles Piercy, with whom she lived, though the two were never married, and whose surname she took and continued to use after they had separated. A separation of some 2 years' standing by the time of the events described here. It was this same John Charles Piercy who would later be called to testify, and who would identify from the witness box a certain garment found wrapped about the murdered woman's head as an old cardigan of his that he had left behind with Mary when they parted. By 1890, Mary Wheeler was 24 years old. She had rooms at 2 Priory Street, Kentish Town, which had been taken for her some 2 years earlier by one of several men who kept her company, and on whom, in the absence of any employment, she appears to have depended. She had never worked. She is described in the sources as a woman who moved among men of some means. The available accounts also record on what appears to be reliable authority that she had suffered from epilepsy since childhood, that she was subject to depression, that she drank, and that she had twice before attempted her own life. These are not offered here as excuses, for they were weighed and found wanting by the authorities of the day. They are offered because they are part of what the record establishes about her, and because they would become, at the very end, the substance of the last effort made to save her. Her connection to the Hogg household ran through Frank Samuel Hogg, the furniture remover, and it is in the nature of that connection that the prosecution would later locate the motive for the crime. The record establishes that Mary and Frank Hogg had been intimate for some years, before his marriage to Phoebe and during it, and that Mary's attachment to him was intense. Among the materials read aloud at her trial were letters in her hand, written to Frank, which spoke of a devotion that could not bear the thought of losing him, and which show on their face that she had known of, and even, in a fashion, urged his marriage to Phoebe when Phoebe's pregnancy made that marriage, by the standards of the time, the expected course. She had told him, in effect, that she would rather see him married many times over than parted from her altogether, and that she would treat his wife as a friend, which, for a while, and by the evidence of Phoebe's own illness and Mary's nursing of her, it appears she did. What changed and why in the autumn of 1890 is the question that the whole of the subsequent proceedings could not finally answer, and it must be treated as such. The prosecution would allege a settled jealousy, a resolve to remove the rival who stood between Mary and the man she regarded as her own. Others, weighing the same evidence afterward, have thought it more likely that a quarrel arose in the moment and turned, without long premeditation, to violence. The record establishes the relationship and the friction within it. It establishes the passion of the letters. It does not, of its own force, establish which reading of the motive is the true one, and this account will not pretend that it does. Motive here is inferred from the evidence. It was never confirmed by any confession that the record will support. It is a rule of accounts such as this that the crime should not be met head-on, at a run, but approached as the investigators approached it, through the last known movements of the woman who died. So the sequence begins not with violence, but with a note. On the morning of Friday, the 24th of October, 1890, Mary Wheeler is said to have given a small boy a penny to carry a message for her, a written invitation to Phoebe Hogg to come to tea that afternoon. That much the record establishes through the boy's own later testimony. Some hours afterward, in the early part of the afternoon, Phoebe Hogg left the rooms at 141 Prince of Wales Road, pushing her infant daughter before her in the family's bassinet perambulator. Her sister-in-law, Clara, who lived in the same house, saw her go, and saw her turn in the direction of Priory Street. That is the last the family saw of her. The next sighting belongs to a stranger. A man of about 60, passing along Priory Street at somewhere near 3:30, noticed a woman in a brownish hat and jacket standing with a perambulator at the door of number 2, and saw the door open to her. Not long after 4 o'clock, a neighbour who lived next door, a woman on friendly terms with the occupant of number 2, heard the sound of breaking glass from within the house, and called over the dividing fence to ask whether all was well, and received no answer. From this point, the direct observation of Phoebe Hogg ends. She was not seen alive again. What happened within the walls of 2 Priory Street, between the drawing of the blinds and the falling of the light, can be reconstructed only from its consequences, and the proper voice for that reconstruction is the flat voice of the evidence, not the raised voice of the narrator. What the medical evidence would afterward establish was that Phoebe Hogg died of two orders of injury: a blunt injury sufficient to fracture the skull, consistent with blows from a heavy implement, and an incised wound to the throat so extensive that the head was very nearly severed from the body. The examination further disclosed bruising to the head and arms of the kind produced when a person raises the hands and arms to ward off a blow, injuries which the record treats as the marks of a struggle, and which the physical condition of the room appeared to confirm, for when the house was later examined, there were 2 broken windows in the kitchen, and every sign that a violent contest had taken place there. The sequence in which the blows and the cut were delivered is described in some secondary accounts as beginning with the poker and ending with the knife. This ordering is a reasonable inference from the wounds, but is not confirmed with certainty by the primary materials, and it is set down here as inference and no more. The child died differently. The medical evidence established that Phoebe Hanslope Hogg died of suffocation. Her small body otherwise unmarked, but for a few scratches. How the suffocation was accomplished, the record does not fix beyond dispute. It is described in some accounts as a deliberate smothering, and in others, perhaps the more probable, though it too is offered as inference, as the consequence of the child's having been placed in the perambulator with the weight of her mother's body laid over her, so that she was suffocated in the course of being carried away rather than by a separate act. The distinction cannot be resolved on the evidence recovered, and this account leaves it open. Of the disposal, the record is more definite, and it is here that the perambulator resumes its place at the centre of the matter. The bodies of mother and child were placed together in the child's own carriage, and that carriage was pushed out into the North London evening and through the streets past a number of people who would later say they had seen a woman wheeling it. Domestic objects tell the rest of the story of concealment, such as it was. A carving knife, its handle bloodied, afterward found in a drawer, an iron poker set back in the fender, a rug that bore bloodstains and that reeked of paraffin where some attempt had been made to wash or mask them, blood-stained clothing, a dark skirt, and a lately washed apron. These are the plain instruments and traces of the afternoon, entered afterward into the official record, and they are eloquent precisely because they are so ordinary. Nothing here required special apparatus. A knife, a poker, a rug, a perambulator, and the cover of darkness were the whole of it. The crime came to light not through detection, but through chance, and through the failure of an evening routine, and the 2 circumstances converged only slowly. At about 7 o'clock on the evening of the 24th, a man returning from his work came upon the body of a woman lying on the pavement of Crossfield Road in Hampstead, and reported it at once to a constable. The head was wrapped in a cardigan. When this was removed, it disclosed the gashed throat and the ruined face of a woman whose identity at that moment no one present could give. The body was taken first to the Hampstead police station and then to the mortuary. The examination of the ground where it lay indicated that the woman had not been killed there, but had been brought to the spot and left. And for a time, the newspapers, reaching for the readiest explanation, speculated that the dead woman had been one of the unfortunate class of the streets. That speculation was wrong, but it delayed the identification. Later, the same evening, a constable on his beat found in Hamilton Terrace, about a mile from where the body lay, a perambulator heavily stained with blood. and the following morning the small body of a child was found on open ground to the north, in the Finchley Road district, dead of suffocation. The city now held 3 discoveries: a murdered woman, a blood-stained child's carriage, and a suffocated infant, which belonged, though no one yet knew it, to a single crime. The thread that drew them together was spun in the Hogg household. Phoebe Hogg had not come home. Her husband, Frank, sat up late, went to his work early, and, still without word of his wife, travelled out toward Chorley Wood on the supposition that she had gone to her ailing father. He found nothing there, and returned to be shown by his mother a newspaper account of the discovery of a murdered woman. His sister Clara, meanwhile, growing anxious, had gone round to Priory Street to ask Mary Wheeler whether she had seen anything of Phoebe. The record establishes that Mary at first denied it, denied more than once that Phoebe had come to her at all, before giving an account that shifted under questioning. Persuaded that the murdered woman might be her sister-in-law, Clara insisted on going to the mortuary, and Mary, with evident reluctance, agreed to accompany her. Mary's conduct at the mortuary is among the most closely recorded features of the case, and it is recorded because those who witnessed it found it strange. On being shown the body, she is said to have declared at once and emphatically, "That's not her." This at a stage when only she and Clara could have known whose body it was, and to have done what she could to prevent Clara from making the identification, becoming almost hysterical as the full extent of the injuries became plain. Clara, for her part, could not recognize the features, but identified the clothing as her sister-in-law's, and afterward identified the perambulator, which had suffered rough usage since she had last seen Phoebe wheeling it away, as Phoebe's own. Suspicion now turned toward Priory Street. The investigation was in the charge of Inspector Thomas Bannister of the Metropolitan Police, whose name the record preserves, though the names of every constable and official who touched the case are not all confirmed in the sources recovered. A search was made of 2 Priory Street, and what it disclosed was, in substance, the scene of the crime. Bloodstains and spatter upon the walls, and by some accounts, the ceiling. Blood upon the floor and the rug. The 2 broken kitchen windows. The carving knife with its bloodied handle. The poker in the fender, the blood-stained skirt, and the washed apron. Throughout this search, the occupant of the house is reported to have seated herself at her piano and whistled and sung, and, when pressed to account for the blood, to have offered the explanation that she had been killing mice, an explanation that persuaded no one, and that has clung to the case ever since, in part because a senior police official afterward recalled her repeating the phrase over and over. On the strength of this, Inspector Bannister arrested Mary Wheeler and charged her with the wilful murder of Phoebe Hogg and on suspicion of the murder of the child. When she was searched, there were blood-stains upon her clothing and scratches upon her hands, and she was found to be wearing 2 wedding rings, one of which was said to be the dead woman's, though here the record is not wholly of one voice, for there is testimony in some accounts that the ring found upon her was disputed as not being the one Frank Hogg had given his wife, and this conflict is set down rather than resolved. She was known throughout as Mrs. Piercy, but the arrest disclosed that she had never married, and it was under the name Mary Eleanor Wheeler that she would be tried, even as the newspapers continued to spell the borrowed surname a dozen different ways, according to how each reporter had caught it by ear. The husband was not spared the machinery of the inquiry, and the record shows that the investigation moved through him as well. Frank Hogg was himself, for a period, a possible suspect, as the husband in such a case must be, and he was searched. It was in the course of this that the connection between him and the prisoner was laid bare, for a key to the house in Priory Street was found upon him, and he admitted, under questioning, that he had been for years on intimate terms with her, while maintaining that his wife had known nothing of it. The lines of inquiry that had begun apart, the unidentified body, the abandoned perambulator, the missing wife, were by this point fully joined, and each fresh statement taken tightened the case around the woman at 2 Priory Street, rather than loosening it. The formal steps that followed were those the law of the day prescribed. A coroner's inquest was held upon the deaths of both mother and child, and the coroner's jury, having heard the evidence and the summing up, returned without difficulty a verdict of wilful murder, naming Mary Eleanor Wheeler as the person by whose acts Phoebe Hogg and her daughter had died. The prisoner was brought before the magistrate at the Marylebone Police Court, where the evidence against her was heard in the ordinary way, and where she was committed to take her trial at the Central Criminal Court. It was while she was in custody, awaiting these proceedings, that she is reported to have said to the woman set to attend her that Mrs. Hogg had indeed come to tea on the afternoon in question, and that, in the course of it, a remark had been made that gave offence and led to a quarrel, an admission she checked almost as soon as she had begun it, appearing to grasp that she was incriminating herself, and declining then to say anything further. It is the nearest the record comes to an account of the afternoon from the only living person who could have given one, and it stops precisely where it becomes evidence of the thing itself. The medical evidence in the case was given at the trial by Dr. Thomas Bond, a police surgeon of considerable standing, whose testimony the proceedings record, and it is on that testimony, entered into the formal record, that any account of the forensic findings must rest. The condition of the adult remains, as they were received for examination, has already been described in its essentials, and it need not be dwelt upon beyond what the evidence requires. The skull had been fractured by blunt force. The throat had been cut with such violence that the head was all but detached. There was bruising to the head, and the arms consistent with an attempt at self-defence. These findings, taken together, established a cause of death that admitted of no innocent explanation, and that pointed to a sustained and deliberate attack, rather than to any single accidental blow. The child's death was established as suffocation. The small body bore no other injury of note beyond a few scratches, and it was the absence of other marks, as much as their presence, that shaped the medical reading of how the infant had died, whether smothered directly or suffocated beneath the weight placed upon her in the perambulator, a question the medical evidence could narrow but not, on the materials recovered, entirely close. Two limitations of the science of the day must be stated plainly, because to pass over them would be to lend the evidence a certainty it did not possess. The first concerns identification. The injuries to the murdered woman's face were such that recognition by feature was difficult, and the identification of the remains as Phoebe Hogg was, at the outset, inferential rather than direct. It rested not on any single certain proof, but on the convergence of several. The clothing, identified by Clara Hogg, the perambulator, identified as Phoebe's, the wedding ring, said to be hers, and the whole surrounding circumstance of her disappearance on the very afternoon she was known to have gone to the house in Priory Street. The record establishes that this convergence was accepted, and reasonably so, but it is right to note that the identification was built up from many strands rather than fixed by one. The second limitation concerns the blood. The forensic science of 1890 could establish that a stain was blood, but it could not, in that era, individualize blood or assign it to a particular person. The means of distinguishing one person's blood from another's lay years in the future. The significance of the bloodstains at Priory Street therefore rested not on any scientific matching to the victim, but on their quantity, their situation throughout the kitchen, and the entire failure of the account offered to explain them. These are the boundaries of what the medical and forensic evidence could and could not prove, and they belong in the record as much as the findings themselves. The trial of Mary Eleanor Wheeler opened at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, on Monday, the 1st of December 1890, and occupied 3 days. The presiding judge was Mr. Justice Denman, a judge who had, some 11 years earlier, tried another notorious case of a woman charged with murder, that of Kate Webster, a circumstance the newspapers of 1890 were quick to recall. The prosecution was conducted by Mr. Forrest Fulton, assisted by Mr. C. F. Gill. The defence was in the hands of Mr. Arthur Hutton. To the indictment for the wilful murder of Phoebe Hogg, the prisoner entered a formal plea of not guilty. The public interest was very great. The case had already filled the newspapers for weeks under the name of the Hampstead Murders, and the opening of the trial drew a large and excited crowd to the Old Bailey, and a heavy attendance of the press, so that the proceedings were reported at length and read across the country. The prosecution's case was built up, as the proceedings that followed show, in an orderly progression of bodies of evidence. There was, first, the discovery, the finding of the murdered woman in Crossfield Road, the finding of the blood-stained perambulator in Hamilton Terrace, the finding of the suffocated child in the Finchley Road district, and the manner in which these were drawn together into a single crime. There was, second, the domestic history, the long connection between the prisoner and Frank Hogg, established from his own testimony and from the letters in her hand, which were read aloud in court, and which the prosecution offered as proof of the depth of her attachment and the strength of her motive. There was, third, the medical testimony, establishing the causes of death and the marks of struggle. And there was, fourth, the conduct of the defendant herself, her denials to Clara Hogg, her behaviour at the mortuary, her demeanour during the search of her house, the bloodstains upon her clothing, the scratches upon her hands, the disputed ring upon her finger, and the account of the mice that no one believed. The defence made what could be made of a case that was, in its nature, circumstantial. Mr. Hutton pressed upon the jury that no one had witnessed the killing, that the evidence against his client was a chain of inference rather than a body of direct proof, and he raised pointedly the question whether a woman of the prisoner's size and build could physically have inflicted injuries so severe upon another grown woman. It was a fair question, and the record shows it was fairly put. It did not succeed. And it did not succeed because the accumulation of physical evidence overwhelmed it. The murder scene in her own kitchen, the witnesses who had seen the perambulator wheeled through the streets, the bloodied clothing, the ruined rug, the knife and the poker, and her own conduct at every stage converged upon a single conclusion that the drawing of inferences could not be made to avoid. The prisoner herself gave no evidence and remained by every account impassive throughout. Before the jury withdrew, the judge summed up the evidence at length, and the manner of his summing up is itself preserved in the reports. He went through the testimony of the witnesses one by one, offering the jury his own assessment of the weight and the truthfulness of each, and he set out for them what they must be satisfied of before they could convict. He directed their attention, in particular, to the window of time within which the death must have occurred, establishing that at some point between about 3:30 and 6 o'clock on the afternoon of the 24th of October, Phoebe Hogg had come to her death by acts that in themselves amounted to murder, and he left it to them to say whether the whole body of circumstantial evidence pointed to the prisoner and to no one else. It was, in substance, an instruction that the case, though circumstantial, was capable of supporting a conviction if the jury found that the chain of inference held. And the reports suggest that the summing up did not incline in the prisoner's favour. The jury retired and returned in a little under an hour, some 52 minutes by the record, on the third day. Mary Eleanor Wheeler was found guilty of the wilful murder of Phoebe Hogg. Asked, in the formal words of the court, whether she had anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed upon her according to the law, she answered, "I say I am innocent of this charge." Mr. Justice Denman then assumed the black cap and pronounced the sentence of death. Between sentence and execution there fell one further passage that belongs to the record, because it is the last point at which the outcome might have been altered. There existed in 1890 no court of criminal appeal. That court would not be established until 1907, and there was accordingly no appeal, in the modern sense, from a verdict of the Central Criminal Court. What remained was an appeal to mercy through the Home Office, and the prisoner's solicitor, Mr. Freak Palmer, pursued it with energy. He assembled evidence of her long-standing epilepsy and of her 2 earlier attempts upon her own life, and argued that she had not been in control of herself at the time of the killing. The Home Office granted a medical inquiry under the Criminal Lunatics Act, and 3 doctors examined her. Their examination did not find evidence of insanity within the strict legal meaning then in force, the standard laid down in the Monaghan Rules, interpreted narrowly in those years, and after their report was considered, the case papers were marked with a settled formula of the age that the law must take its course. That decision was communicated to her solicitor, and the sentence stood. The execution was fixed for Tuesday, the 23rd of December 1890, 2 days before Christmas, at Newgate Prison, and the executioner was James Berry. It was carried out within the walls of the prison, and not in public, in accordance with the law that had governed such matters since the Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868, the statute that had ended public hanging in England and required that executions be conducted within the prison, and witnessed only by those officially present. The Sheriff of London, Sir James Whitehead, went further in this instance and excluded the reporters of the press from the execution itself. Those officially present are named in the accounts: the Sheriff and the Under-Sheriff, Mr. Metcalfe, the Chaplain, the Reverend Mr. Duffield, the Governor of Newgate, Colonel Milman, the Prison Surgeon, Dr. Gilbert, and the warders and wardresses who had guarded the condemned woman through her last days and who attended her to the end. Berry set a drop of 6 feet for her. She weighed 9 stone, and the record states that death was instantaneous. Of the prisoner's demeanour in her final hours much was written, and it must be handled with the caution such accounts always require, for the reports of prison officials and the press in these matters are shaped as often by what the public wished to hear as by what was strictly observed. What is consistently reported is her composure. Berry himself, in his later recollection, described her as the most composed person in the whole of the party assembled for the execution. Whether that composure was resignation or exhaustion, or something the observers could not read, the record does not say, and this account will not guess. On the question of a confession, the record is clear in one respect and unclear in another. Mary Wheeler made no confession. She had refused to confess to her mother and refused to confess to her solicitor, even under close and repeated questioning, and she maintained to the last her denial of the crime. On her final afternoon, she asked Mr. Freak Palmer to attend to certain small matters and to place, on her behalf, an advertisement in a Madrid newspaper whose text has come down as a string of initials, a message to the effect that its author had not betrayed some person or trust known only to herself, and she declined absolutely to explain what it meant. What she said at the very last upon the scaffold is reported in more than one form. In some accounts she acknowledged that her sentence was just while insisting that much of the evidence against her had been false, and in others the words are given the opposite sense, so that even her final statement survives in versions that cannot be fully reconciled. She was buried, as the law then required of those executed within its walls, in an unmarked grave inside the precincts of Newgate. With her burial, the legal proceedings in the matter of Phoebe Hogg were, in the formal sense, concluded and closed. The case did not end with the burial, because cases of this kind rarely do, and the manner of its afterlife is itself part of the record. The press coverage at the time was very large, and the crime passed at once, under the name of the Hampstead murders, into the popular literature of Victorian crime. Madame Tussaud's waxwork exhibition, following its long practice with celebrated cases, prepared a tableau of the condemned woman for its Chamber of Horrors, and purchased from Frank Hogg the very perambulator in which the bodies had been carried, together with articles from the kitchen at Priory Street, and displayed them to a public that came in great numbers to see them. The instruments of the case thus became objects of exhibition, and the rope used at the execution passed in time into the collection of the Police Museum at Scotland Yard, where such relics were kept. In this way, the physical remnants of the crime survived long after the proceedings that produced them, which is more than can be said for most cases of the period. The case survived too as a subject of study and of speculation, and here 2 strands must be distinguished. The first is legitimate. The criminal historian F. Tennyson Jessie examined the case in her writing on English crime, and later writers and researchers, among them the modern author Sarah Beth Hopton, who returned to the primary materials and corrected some of the errors that had accumulated around the family's history, have treated it seriously. The crime has furnished the matter for later works, including a novel published in our own time, drawn from the events of 1890. The second strand is more doubtful, and requires the caution the record always demands of an inference unsupported by proof. Because Phoebe Hogg had been found in the street with her throat cut, and because the Whitechapel murders were then only 2 years past and still unsolved, the name of Mary Wheeler became attached in some later writing to the list of persons proposed as the killer known as Jack the Ripper, a proposal advanced most fully in a book of 1939 and revived from time to time since. It should be stated plainly that this connection rests upon no physical evidence and no eyewitness account whatever, that it was not seriously entertained by the authorities of the day, and that the great majority of careful students of the Whitechapel case have given it little credence. It is a legend that grew around the figure of a convicted woman, and it is set down here as legend and identified as such. There remains one matter that the record, left to itself, tends to obscure, and it is right to name it directly. In almost every account of this case, the murdered woman appears not as a person, but as an occasion. The wife who was killed, the reason the killer became famous. And her infant daughter is remembered, when she's remembered at all, by a nickname. Phoebe Hogg has been reduced, across the long afterlife of the case, to the circumstance of her death, while the name of the woman who killed her has been printed, exhibited, novelized, and disputed for more than a century. And there is a quiet injustice in that, which the record cannot repair, but which it can at least acknowledge. Of any statutory reform following directly from the case, the record shows none that can be reliably claimed, and this account will not manufacture one. The case endures not through any law it changed, but through the completeness with which it was documented and the persistence with which it has been retold. The case of Mary Eleanor Wheeler was the single matter examined in this account. The conviction was entered. The execution was carried out in 1890. The case became part of the national record. It has not left,